Hey there, it's Ardith, and I'm excited to be here to help Michelle kick off her annual Case Me a Christmas Card event. Michelle's done this event for a few years now, where she and her guests choose an inspiration card from each other and then make their own version of it. If you were here last year, then you'll remember that it was also the very first time I introduced my LIMES acronym, which helps you translate inspiration, whether it's a card or anything else, into a card that has a similar feel but is completely your own. This year I'll be using it again and showing you some of the refinements I've made to it to make it even easier. Let's start with my inspiration from Michelle's card. I chose this cheery Christmas card from Michelle's Instagram feed. To use LIMES, I start by listing all the things I like about my inspiration. I've refined the process a bit by dividing listing into colors, techniques, and elements. Michelle's card has 2 shades of green, red, and white. For techniques, Michelle has used stenciling, maybe some stamping, I think, for those trees, and die cutting for the trees and the sentiment. And then I list the elements. Like, there's kind of a snowflake feel for the stencil. There's 3 trees, red dots, green candy swirl dots, a white strip with the Merry Christmas sentiment. To start my first card, I created a panel of green cardstock by swinking Lime Ricky ink onto white cardstock. You can see that my ink pad is pretty dry, and I'm pouncing and really pushing that ink onto the cardstock. Let me show you how it smooths out as it dries, though. This is after a few minutes, and by the time the card is finished, the color will be perfectly smooth. But it's dry enough for me to use this Studio Light stencil to add a row of stenciled snowflakes down the center of my panel. This stencil has 3 different patterns, so I masked off the patterns I'm not using for this card, as well as the rest of the panel, before I blended some Deck the Hall ink through. I prefer brushes when I'm blending through a stencil because I found that foam applicators can get damaged by stencil edges if I press too hard. My next step is to blend some more of that dark green ink around the edges of the panel. These edges will be showing around my tree focal image, and the darker green will add some more depth and contrast. As I'm blending, I'm putting more pressure on the left side of the brush so that the darker ink fades naturally into the lighter green ink. This panel is still not completely dry, and that also helps the blend. Once the border was fully blended, I spritzed the whole panel with some Ariel shimmer spray. I set the panel aside to dry, and now I'm going to use one of my well-loved background stamps, the Polka Dots Turnabout from Concord and 9th. I'm not going to turn it though, so I can place the stamp and my cardstock right in the corner of my Misty. One of the beauties of this particular stamp is that it looks great when you stamp it once, twice, 3, or 4 times, and that means you can get a lot of different looks with it. Right now, I want some tiny red dots, but not too many. I want the panel to still be light and airy. I'm using Rockin' Red ink and my whiteboard eraser with its felt bottom to rub over the Misty door and get some even pressure. This is another ink pad that needs refilling, so I stamped it a second time, and of course, because the stamp and the paper didn't move within the Misty, it stamps right back down in the exact same spot. I cut the largest waffle flower nesting Christmas tree die from the white panel, and then I used a rectangle die to trim the white panel so that the green panel edges will be visible around it. By the way, I'm using an adaptation of Jennifer Maguire's tip here for my die cutting sandwich. I've got these green double-sided Gemini plates taped to a clear cutting plate. I've taped one on the top and one on the bottom. I do need to add a cardstock shim to get clean cuts on intricate dies, but I've been using this for about a month so far, and I've had absolutely no warping. Before I heat emboss my sentiment, here's a tip for making sure that your panel is absolutely dry. This is important because I put so much ink plus the shimmer spray on it, and I don't want powder sticking everywhere. So I just poured my powder over the panel without any stamping. If it sticks to the panel, then the panel needs more drying time, but this one looks good to go. I have my white panel already loaded up with foam tape so that it'll be a dimensional frame over the green panel, and I put it in place so I can see where I need to position my stamp. I chose this All Is Calm sentiment mostly because it's the one that will fit inside that Christmas tree shaped hole, and I'd cut it apart for a previous card, so that gives me a little flexibility as far as spacing and making the best use of the tree shape. Once it was lined up, I lifted it with the Misty door and I removed the white panel. Then I inked up the stamp with some Wow embossing ink. I usually like to stamp my embossing ink twice just to be sure it's good and sticky before pouring my white embossing powder over top. Then I put the green panel into a foil-lined shoebox lid. Using this lid means I'm not trying to hold on to the panel I'm heating, which keeps my fingers safe, and I think the foil reflects back heat and reduces warping. Now this looks good, but another Jennifer tip with white embossing powder is to put the panel back into the MISTI and stamp it again with the embossing ink, right on top of that slick embossing. Then add another layer of embossing powder and heat it up until it's melted and smooth. This gives a really bold, white, almost dimensional embossing result. So now let's review this card. I've included 2 shades of green, red and white, stenciling, stamping, and die cutting, a Christmas tree, red dots, and a white sentiment. I used only 1 tree instead of 3. I embossed my white sentiment instead of die cutting it, and my red dots are not on the tree. I excluded the green candy swirls. As for adding my own spin, I'm not sure I really did that beyond what I've said already, and that's okay. To start my second card, I cut a piece of satin cardstock into a square, and I'm going to use an Altenew embossing folder to add some interest. This is such a simple thing to do, but the metallic reflections from the texture add so much to a card. This is going to be the back of my focal point, which is going to be created with this square frame die from Frantic Stamper. It's got very narrow lines, so I used some big double-sided tape from scrapbook.com on the back, so I won't have to try and use liquid glue when I stack them up. This tape is 4 inches wide, so it's easy to cover the back of a panel of white cardstock. I ran it through my die cutting machine and then I popped it out of the die with a piercing tool. Once you get it out of the die, you can peel back the release paper and that will often take out all the inside pieces that you don't want to use. And if it doesn't take them all out, then you can pop out the remaining ones quite easily. I do advise putting them specifically somewhere sticky side down. Once they're sticky, you never know where they'll turn up. I found one on my elbow after my shower the next day. To add the backer to the frame, I find it easiest to cut the backer slightly smaller so that it doesn't have to be exact. Then I put the frame down so the sticky side is up, and I add the backer on top, making sure that no edges are overhanging the frame. Now you can see that the geometric background is making the lines of the trees kind of disappear, and I'll fix that in a minute. But first I cut another frame and I stacked it on top the exact same way. While I'm working here, please notice that this frame cuts 2 full Christmas trees. I'll be coming back to them for my final card. But first, those white lines are not showing up at all on this, so I need a fix. I grabbed the negative pieces from one of my cuts and I swinked some of that Deck the Halls ink onto it. They all got stuck onto the ink pad, and the first couple I lifted with my fingers and popped them onto the frame, but that was very messy. For the last 2 pieces, I pushed down on one edge with my craft pick. That made the other end pop up, and it was much easier to lift them and put them in place. These look super dark right now, but they'll dry back into that deep green, and this contrast is really helping this little forest scene come to life. I wanted to add some red dots, and I spent quite a bit of time looking through my sequins, jewels, and pearls, but most of them are translucent, so when I put them on the dark trees, they didn't really pop. So I created my own embellishments by adding some red ink, oh my, this really is dry, to another piece of white cardstock before adding that double-sided tape to the back. I ran this panel through my die cutting machine with this Catherine Pooler cover plate. Because of the tape on the back, most of the dots stayed in place, and that means I can add as many as I want to this card and put the panel into my pocket with the die, and I can keep any leftovers for a future project. I added a couple of red dots to each of the trees. I tried out some white ones in the sky, but in the end I really just wanted to leave that shiny geometric background alone. I added a white panel that had also been embossed, and I added some white gel pen to the dots to make them look round. Okay, for this card, I included the 2 shades of green, red and white. I only used die cuts for this card. I included Christmas trees, a geometric background, red dots. I modified the number of trees, the background technique from stenciling to an embossing folder. I excluded the green candy swirls and a sentiment altogether. I think anyone who gets this card will know it's a Christmas card. For my spin, I changed the card to my signature 4 1/4 inch square format. I love this size because it gives me the modern look of a square, but it still fits into an A2 sized envelope, so it doesn't require extra postage. My third card came from an idea with those extra Christmas trees I cut in the previous card. But first, once again, I started with a lime Ricky panel. This time I'm adding some tone-on-tone stenciling with a Catherine Pooler stencil. This one has that candy swirl design that I've been excluding so far. I added more lime Ricky ink by swirling it around the center of the twisted sunburst, but I didn't take it all the way out. I just eased off the pressure and let it fade. Then I moved this stencil to the bottom of my panel and I did it again. Now here's my crazy idea. 6 of these little trees can be put together to form kind of a chunky snowflake. Isn't that fun? I popped up all 12 of the trees and glued them onto the green panel that I had trimmed to a square. For my sentiment, I grabbed the Carly alphabet from iCrafter. This one has small letters in upper and lowercase. I cut them twice from cardstock with that tape on the back, and I added them to the card in the space in the top right corner. Then I grabbed some of those leftover red confetti dots and I added a few across the card. This card makes me think of the Grinch in Whoville, and it makes me laugh. Let's take a look at it. I've got 2 shades of green, red and white. I've used stenciling and die cutting. I've included 2 snowflakes that kind of echo Michelle's stenciling, a white die cut sentiment, red dots, and finally the green candy swirl element. I modified the tree element to become part of the 2 floral snowflake elements that Michelle had, and I changed the sentiment from Merry Christmas to Joy. I think you could say that I excluded the trees, although I kind of included them as well. I'll leave that one up to you. And again, I used my 4 1/4 inch square format. I love that these cards were all inspired by one card, and yet they're all so different. And you could use the same inspiration and come up with even more different cards. There's really no way to fail when you use limes as a guide. And if you want to see where it all started, click here for my very first limes video from last year's Case Me a Christmas card event. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.